I stood in the parking garage of the Harrington Conference Centre, staring at my reflection in the tinted window of someone else's SUV. 63 years old, and I was standing there in a catering uniform I'd borrowed from my neighbour's daughter. Black slacks, white button-down, the little burgundy vest that pinched at my shoulders. I barely recognized myself. That was the point, of course. My husband had told me he had a 2-day consulting retreat in Columbus. He kissed my cheek on Thursday morning, wheeled his overnight bag out the front door, and that was that. 31 years of marriage, and he still kissed my cheek the same way he kissed the dog, out of habit, without thinking. I'd almost believed him. Almost. It was my daughter-in-law who found it by accident. She'd borrowed my tablet to look something up and came across a confirmation email I hadn't seen. Corporate gala dinner. The Harrington. Friday evening, 7 o'clock. My husband's name was listed on the RSVP as a presenting sponsor. Not a consultant. A sponsor. Which meant he hadn't just attended. He'd paid to be there. He'd never mentioned it. Not once. I sat with that information for 3 days. I didn't sleep well. I kept running the logic backward, trying to find the innocent explanation. Maybe he'd planned to surprise me. Maybe he'd bought out a table for clients and simply forgot to mention it. Maybe I was the kind of woman who invented problems where none existed. But then I thought about the other things I'd noticed over the past 8 months. The new gym membership he never seemed to use. The way he'd started keeping his phone face down on every service. The Tuesday nights he claimed were late client dinners that left no charge on our shared card. Small things. Things I'd talked myself out of caring about, one by one. I stopped talking myself out of it. My neighbour's daughter, Tanya, works for a catering company called Prestige Events that handles a lot of the corporate functions downtown. I've known her since she was 11 years old. I told her I needed a favour and I needed her not to ask too many questions, and she looked at me for a long moment and said, "I'll put you on the Henderson party list for Friday." She handed me a uniform and a name badge that said staff, and she squeezed my hand before she let go. I arrived at 6:15 and blended into the set-up crew. The Harrington's main ballroom was the kind of space that made you feel small on purpose. Vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, round tables dressed in white linen with low floral centerpieces that probably cost more than my first car. The room seated about 250. By 7 it was full. I moved through the crowd with a tray of champagne flutes. That's the thing nobody tells you about wearing a uniform in a room full of people who don't want to see you. You actually become invisible. I've attended fundraisers in that same building. I've worn the cocktail dress and the good earrings and stood in rooms just like it making polite conversation. But put a tray in my hands and a vest on my back and suddenly I was furniture. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody said thank you. People reached for glasses the way they reached for handrails, automatically, without acknowledgement. It should have bothered me. That night it was a gift. I spotted my husband near the bar at 7:20. He was wearing the charcoal blazer I'd picked out for his birthday 2 years ago. He looked good. That was the thing that caught in my throat. He looked relaxed and confident and genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. He was laughing at something the man beside him had said, head tilted back, the way he used to laugh when we were young. I positioned myself near a high-top table close enough to hear without being seen, and I watched him. He wasn't alone in the way a man at a work function is usually alone. He kept gravitating back to the same spot near the second window, returning to it between conversations the way you return to something that anchors you. I watched him do it twice before I understood why. She was standing there, early 40s I would guess, dark hair pulled back. She was wearing a deep green dress that fit her the way expensive things fit when they're chosen deliberately. She laughed at something my husband said and put her hand briefly on his forearm. Not a work touch, not the quick professional contact of colleagues. A touch that had its own grammar, a touch that knew where it was going. I kept my face neutral. I'd been a high school counselor for 24 years. I knew how to keep my face neutral. I circulated the room. I refilled water glasses. I collected empty appetizer plates. I did the job I was pretending to do, and I came back around every few minutes and I watched. They were comfortable together. That was what made it real in a way I hadn't expected. I think I'd half hoped to catch something I could explain away, a moment of flattery, something professional gone sideways, the kind of thing you could bring home and argue about and eventually put behind you. But comfort isn't something you perform. You can't fake the ease of two people who have learned each other's rhythms. At 8:15, the dinner service began. I helped carry out the first course from the kitchen corridor, and I timed my approach to their table carefully. They were seated together. Of course they were seated together. She was on his left. There was a small placard at her setting, Dr. Aubrey Finch, regional director. My husband was in commercial real estate. She was apparently in healthcare administration. I filed that away the way I'd been filing everything else all evening. Quietly, completely. I set down a bread plate. My husband didn't look up. I stood there for just a half second longer than I needed to, and in that half second I thought about 31 years. The apartment we'd shared with no central heat our first winter together. The miscarriage we'd gotten through in 1998 that we never talked about afterward, but that I thought about every single year in March. The way he'd held my hand in the hospital when my mother was dying and hadn't let go for 6 hours. I thought about all of it, and I put it somewhere safe. And I walked back to the kitchen. I wasn't ready yet. The speeches started just before 9. The gala was a fundraiser for a regional children's hospital foundation, a cause I actually support, which was its own particular cruelty. The CEO gave remarks, a board member gave remarks, and then the evening's MC, a cheerful man in a too-tight dinner jacket, announced the presenting sponsors. My husband stood. She stood with him. To the couple who really made this evening possible, the MC said, grinning, clearly in on something the room was in on too. Word has it we might be celebrating more than just a successful fundraiser tonight. Anything you want to share? The table around them laughed. A few people in adjacent seats raised their glasses. Someone called out, "Come on, give us something." My husband looked at her. She looked at him, and she held up her left hand. There was a ring on it. The room made the sound rooms make when a secret becomes public, that particular collective exhale that is somewhere between a cheer and a sigh. People clapped. My husband put his arm around her shoulders. He was beaming. He was absolutely beaming. I was standing 12 feet away, holding a water pitcher. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because I think the honest version is more complicated than people expect. It wasn't just heartbreak, though that was there. It was something more like vertigo, the sudden understanding that the life you've been living has a completely different map than the one you were given. That every dinner, every night he came home late, every weekend trip to see the Hendersons or meet with the Garfield account had been threaded through with a reality I hadn't been allowed to see. I set the water pitcher down on the nearest surface. I took one breath, and then I walked toward the center of the room. I wasn't running. I wasn't crying. I want that to be clear because I think sometimes people imagine a woman in this situation becoming undone. And I did not become undone. I walked steadily, the way I'd walked into difficult conversations for 2 decades of counseling teenagers through the worst moments of their young lives. One foot and then the other. Chin level. Eyes forward. I stopped about 6 feet from where they were standing. My husband saw me before anyone else did. The colour left his face so completely and so quickly it was almost clinical to watch. His arm dropped from her shoulders. She noticed his expression and turned. "Hi," I said. I was using my quiet voice, the one that carries even when it's quiet. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the MC faltered. The room went uncertain. "I'm his wife," I said. I didn't gesture. I didn't need to. 31 years. I just wanted to come say congratulations in person. There was a silence that had weight to it. My husband said my name. Just my name once, the way you'd say it if you were trying to stop a car with your bare hands. "I drove down from home," I said pleasantly. "I saw the confirmation email for the event. You mentioned Columbus and I thought, Funny, the Harrington is in Dayton, so I wanted to see for myself. The woman in the green dress, Dr. Finch, had gone very still. To her credit, she didn't pretend. She looked at me with something that wasn't quite shame, but was at least in the same neighborhood. "Did you know?" I asked her, not unkindly. I genuinely wanted to know. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "He told me you'd been separated for 2 years." I nodded slowly. "We live in the same house," I said. "We share a bank account and a golden retriever and a standing reservation at Carmine's every other Saturday, but separated." "Sure." Someone at a nearby table made a small sound. I think it might have been a laugh, but I'm not certain. I looked at my husband then. I looked at him for a long moment, and I want to tell you that what I felt was pure fury, because fury would be a simpler story. What I actually felt was grief, but not the collapsing kind. The clarifying kind, the kind that burns off everything that isn't essential and leaves you standing in what's left. "I'm not going to make a scene," I told him. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" he asked. His voice was careful, controlled, even now managing. "This is me, not pretending anymore," I said. "I'm done pretending I don't see what I see. I've been doing that for a long time, and I'm finished." I turned to the room then, not theatrically, not for effect, just because the room was there and I was done conducting this like a private conversation when it had never really been a private matter. "I apologize for the interruption," I said to the 200 people staring at me. "It's a wonderful cause. Please enjoy the rest of your evening." And I walked out. I walked through the corridor and past the coat check and out through the main doors into the October air, and I stood on the sidewalk outside the Harrington Conference Center. And I breathed. My hands were shaking. I noticed that with a sort of detached interest. The rest of me felt strangely calm, not numb. I want to be clear about the difference because I've seen numb, and this wasn't it. Calm, like something that had been held under pressure for a very long time, had finally been released, and my body was just catching up to the relief of it. I called my daughter-in-law from the parking garage. She didn't ask questions. She said, "Come to our house." I did. I'm going to skip over the months that followed in the way you skip over terrain you've already crossed. Not because it wasn't real, but because it doesn't belong to anyone but me. There were lawyers, there were conversations, there were nights I lay awake in my son's guest room, listening to the sound of the house settling and thinking about who I was going to be on the other side of all this. My husband and Dr. Finch are no longer engaged, from what I understand. Whether that's a consequence of what happened or something they arrived at separately, I don't know, and I've stopped trying to. What I know is this. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years being a good wife to a man who decided that meant I wouldn't notice or wouldn't say anything if I did. I noticed. I said something. There were people who asked me afterward why I did it the way I did it. Why the catering uniform? Why the public venue? Why not just confront him at home? And I've thought about that question seriously because it deserves a serious answer. I didn't go to that gala to humiliate him. I went because I needed to see it with my own eyes, not filtered through a forwarded email or a second-hand account or my own anxious interpretation of small signs. I needed to know the truth was the truth before I let it change everything. And I think, if I'm honest, I needed him to know that I'd seen it, not for revenge, not to punish him in public, but because I had been invisible in that marriage for a long time. Invisible in the way women in long marriages sometimes become invisible, gradually, without anyone intending it. And I needed one moment where I was fully, completely, undeniably visible. I got that. It's enough. I'm living in a small house now, about 20 minutes from my son. It has a back porch that gets afternoon sun and a kitchen I've repainted twice just because I could. My golden retriever sleeps at the foot of my bed. Some mornings I wake up and the first feeling isn't grief. Some mornings the first feeling is something that takes me a minute to name, because it's been a while. It's relief. You spend so many years managing, appearances, managing your own reactions, managing your dintinipittans between what you know and what you can prove and what you're willing to say out loud. And then one day you stop managing. You put down the tray. You walk to the center of the room. You say the thing you've been not saying. And then you walk out into the cold air and you breathe and you find out that the thing you were most afraid of, the falling apart, the not surviving it, doesn't happen the way you thought it would. You survive it differently than you imagined. Not intact exactly, but whole. There's a difference, and I know that now. If you're holding something right now that you've been managing for too long, I want you to hear this from someone who spent decades thinking patience was the same thing as wisdom, and dignity meant silence. It doesn't. Sometimes the most dignified thing you can do is walk into the room exactly as you are, say exactly what is true, and then leave without looking back. I know, because that's what I did, and I would do it again. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened that night. Not the dramatic version, not the version that sounds good when you're describing it to someone over coffee. The real version, which is quieter and more complicated and, in the end, more useful to me. Here's what I know about cause and effect. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up all at once. It builds the way water builds behind a dam, slowly, invisibly, and then all at once in a way that cannot be undone. My husband didn't make one bad decision. He made 100 small ones, each one a little more comfortable than the last, each one depending on my silence to survive. And I had been silent, not because I was weak, but because I had confused keeping the peace with keeping the truth. Those are not the same thing. I understand that now. The night I walked into the Harrington in that catering vest, I wasn't acting on impulse. I was acting on something I'd spent months accumulating, every turned-over phone, every vague answer, every instinct I'd talked myself out of honoring. That accumulation is its own kind of intelligence. The body keeps score even when the mind is still negotiating. I'd spent too long overruling what I already knew, and what I've learned, genuinely learned, not just understood in theory, is that overruling your own perception for the sake of someone else's comfort is a form of self-abandonment. You can only do it so many times before it costs you something you can't get back. What I want to say about courage is this. It isn't the absence of fear. I was afraid that whole evening. My hands were shaking when I set down that water pitcher. But I've come to believe that real courage isn't the dramatic gesture. It's the 1,000 small moments before it where you decide, quietly, that you are worth the truth. I had to arrive at that decision slowly over months, and when I finally did, the act itself was almost simple. Almost. The thing nobody talks about in stories like mine is what happens to your sense of self after. Not the logistics, the lawyers, the paperwork, the dividing of things, but the internal reckoning. Who were you in that marriage? Who did you become gradually without noticing? And who do you want to be now that the architecture of it is gone? Those are the questions that take the real time, not the confrontation. That was one evening. The reconstruction is the work of years. I'm not the same woman who drove to Dayton that October night. I'm quieter in some ways, more deliberate. I ask myself more often whether I'm saying what I actually mean or whether I'm managing again. That distinction between honesty and management has become the thing I come back to most. Dr. Finch never reached out to me. I don't hold that against her. She was lied to, in her own way. What my husband built required deceiving everyone in it, including himself. And that kind of self-deception has a cost that eventually comes due no matter how carefully you've arranged things. I chose to walk out of that gala with my head level. I chose not to collapse. Not because I didn't feel it, I felt all of it, but because I had already decided, somewhere in those months of watching and waiting, that I was not going to let his choices define the size of my dignity. That decision is mine. It was always mine. I just had to remember it.